Chapter 7. Ministrations to those in quarantine, who were often visited by the saint. 1576. Great was the satisfaction the saint derived from the results of his labors, for he now saw the sick provided with every consolation they could have had in their own homes. Both he himself and all his priests, by a special privilege from the Apostolic See, were enabled also to grant the plenary indulgence at the hour of death. There was another part of his flock which now began to claim his care. It did not escape him that the 40 days of quarantine, if given up to idleness, afforded many temptations to sin. He therefore was heedful to provide that this time should be spent so as to promote the glory of God and the salvation of their souls. In the first place, he required the clergy to make it a time of penance and fasting, as they were just now entering on the season of Advent, and urged on the laity the duty of confession and communion before beginning it. Next, in order to sanctify the time, he directed that every one should hear Mass devoutly every day, and to give effect to this order, he erected altars at the crossways and conspicuous places where Mass was said daily, so that all could assist from their windows. In the same way he arranged for confessions to be heard, sending priests round at stated times from house to house, the confessor sitting on the doorstep outside, and the penitent kneeling within, the door serving as a barrier. The parish priest went round with the Blessed Sacrament on Sundays, and gave Holy Communion on the doorsteps to all, as if they had been cloistered religious. He also made arrangements that each district should keep 7 times of prayer throughout the day and night, singing psalms and hymns in 2 choirs, after the manner of a chapter of canons, and saying suitable prayers, each hour being announced by ringing the great bell of the cathedral. When it sounded, all the inhabitants attended at their windows. A priest or other person appointed began the prayers, and all the people on their knees made the responses, each having the book of prayers, which the cardinal had printed for the purpose. It was a sight to see, when all the inhabitants of this populous city, numbering little short of 300,000 souls, united to praise God at one and the same time, sending up together an harmonious voice of supplication for deliverance from their distress. Milan might at this time have been not unfitly compared to a cloister of religious of both sexes, serving God in the enclosure of their cells, an image of the heavenly Jerusalem, filled with the praises of the angelic hosts. To provide still further against the evils of idleness, St. Charles sent round a pastoral letter, suggesting how the rest of their time might be profitably spent in mental prayer and spiritual reading, and granted special indulgences to those who practiced these exercises and prayed for the sick. While he was thus intent in keeping all well employed, he was always the first to set an example of punctuality in fulfilling his own obligations, as the head and guide of all. Every day, and we may say every night, he visited the hospital, the huts, or some part of the city, according to a plan he had laid down, allotting a separate district to each day of the week. He never returned home till he had accomplished this duty, though it was often 10 or 11 o'clock at night. By these constant visits, everyone was kept up to his work, and his continual presence encouraged all to persevere. At the same time, it was a consolation to him in the midst of his toils to see his people in tranquillity of mind, praising God and laboring to save their souls in a time of perplexity and distress. By this means, too, he obtained an immediate knowledge of the needs of his flock, for as he passed along the streets, those who were confined to their houses by the quarantine were sure to run to the windows and beg his blessing on their knees. Thus everyone had an opportunity of making known to him, as to their common Father, all their needs. For their confidence in him was so great, that many laid open to him their sorrows, which they had no mind to publish to the committee appointed to provide for temporal distress. And this was the case with the respectable classes also. In order that he might not forget any of these numerous appeals, he carried a book with him, in which he noted down their tale, and always left them encouraged and consoled. Besides the regular rations which he distributed to the necessitous, He was always accompanied on his rounds by 2 priests on horseback, carrying a store of articles for the sick, which he would distribute among the poor with his own hands, as well as alms where he saw there was need. And he would take the opportunity of inquiring whether his orders had been carried out, so that his little book was no bare collection of facts, but was the means of the removal or alleviation of distress. Nor did his charity stop here. He was always ready to enter the infected houses, to go to the bedsides of those in their last agony, in order to dispose them to die in the love of God. We have seen him groping his way in through a window or climbing a ladder to enter where the door was closed, for he would rather have suffered any inconvenience than that one soul should be left without aid and its salvation imperiled. Time would fail us to tell of his many charities, or of the cures following upon his blessing, which may be read in the processes of his canonization. It may be sufficient here to speak of the general estimation in which he was held by all the people, who looked upon him as an angel of God, rejoicing whenever they saw him, as if he came to open heaven to them. His zeal, moreover, seemed to overflow upon all the priests who served under him, and made them emulate his fervor and self-devotion in administering the last sacraments to the sick, who at that time were passing to a better life. But while his solicitude for all his flock was great, he spent himself with all his heart upon those priests and others who at his wish had given themselves up to the service of the plague-stricken, always holding it to be his special charge to see that they wanted for nothing, and himself to administer to them the last consolations. Chapter 8. St. Charles administers the sacraments to the plague-stricken. 1576. In pursuance of his resolution to fulfill all the offices of a good shepherd to his flock, St. Charles thought himself bound to give the sacrament of confirmation to those who were as yet unconfirmed and in danger of death. For though not a sacrament absolutely necessary to salvation, he could not let any die without having this grace. He gave notice, therefore, to all those who were unconfirmed to prepare themselves for receiving it devoutly. He then went through the streets in his pontificals, and anointed the candidates with the holy chrism from door to door, with all solemnity possible under the circumstances. Out of reverence to the sacrament, it had not been customary to admit children under 9 years of age to it. But although the cardinal had made it his practice to confirm every Pentecost in different churches, still several thousand persons presented themselves to receive it on this occasion. Among them, it is thought, must have been many who were already sick of the plague. When he went on the visitation of his diocese, of which we give an account in the next chapter, he continued in his purpose of not suffering the plague-stricken to die without confirmation, and administered it first in the town of Sesto, on the road to Monza, where the pestilence had made great havoc. While he was so engaged, a great number of the infected testified their desire for the sacrament. The saint turned to Father Ludovico Moneta, and asked his opinion of what he ought to do in the case. The good priest would not give any counsel, but that if the cardinal thought fit to grant the request, he would gladly assist. While the saint stood in doubt, a number of the poor creatures, moved by an extraordinary desire for the Holy Chrism, fell together at his feet. The attendants, frightened at the risk, cried out to them not to come too near. But when St. Charles perceived the strength of their desire, he would not send them away, saying, "It is the will of God. Let them come for their consolation." After confirming all who presented themselves, he perceived a number of people linger at some distance, who durst not approach. Inquiring why they did not come, he was told that they considered their cases too bad and the danger too great. "Shall we then," said he, "let them die without the sacrament? Nay, let them come also." After this he never hesitated any more, but confirmed all who desired it, how great soever the danger might be. And he was often called upon to confer the sacrament even in the houses of the dead, not unfrequently upon the dying, and on one occasion at Trezzo, a man fell dead at his feet the moment after he had received the chrism. In his visits to the sick, he found himself called upon at times to administer the sacrament of baptism also. For there were many cases of children born in the temporary huts, whither the mothers had been removed on the plague spot appearing, and as they were in danger of death, he baptized them and then sent them out to nurse. One case of a little Negro girl, whom he met with in this way, was very remarkable on account of a miracle which he afterwards worked upon her. He frequently had the consolation of fulfilling the promise he had made of giving the last sacraments to the parochial clergy and some of the other priests who had devoted themselves to the care of the sick. This was the case with the parish priest of San Raffaele in Milan. It was reported to the cardinal that he had caught the infection, and he immediately presented himself at his bedside, and perceiving his case to be desperate, bade him prepare himself for receiving the last rites, which he would administer himself, assuring him that he would not lose sight of him as long as he was alive. The following day he returned to give him Holy Communion and extreme unction, and with this intention said Mass that morning in the church of San Raffaele, and gave communion to the priest's acolyte, who died of the plague. He then changed his vestments in order to administer the sacraments to the sick priest in his own room. His attendants, among them Monsignor Seneca and Bernardino Taruggi, were panic-struck at his purpose, but did not venture either to interpose between the saint and his zeal, or to follow him in his heroism, but hung back in fear and hesitation. St. Charles nevertheless turned towards the chamber of death in his pontifical vestments, with the Blessed Sacrament in his hand. He was met on his way by John Baptist Capra, deputy governor, and Alfonso Galarato, his lieutenant, and other members of the city council, who had come together to beg him on their knees, in the name of the state, not to expose his precious life to risk. They urged that he was endangering himself without any necessity, since any priest might act for him, and were accompanied by several priests, who were ready to go in his place, rather than that he should be exposed again to danger. They bid him reflect what would be their condition if the venture should prove fatal to him, that his beloved city and diocese would then indeed be left desolate, and the poor and the sick be in despair. Thus all the religious exercises he had instituted would fall into disuse, and his priests, whom his example had encouraged to attend the plague-stricken with so much charity, would lose heart when they had their pastor no longer with them. They prayed him, therefore, for the love of Jesus Christ and his flock, to listen to them, and if he had no regard for his own safety, at least to consider the entreaties of his spiritual children. St. Charles stood firm, however, still bearing the Blessed Sacrament, and listened to all they had to say, while the tears rolled down his cheeks, as he perceived the sincerity and earnestness of their affection, which had brought them to his feet. Yet he would not suffer himself to be carried away by these human feelings from the duties of his episcopal office, but answered them briefly, that while he fully appreciated their attachment, he prayed them not to take it ill that he could not abandon his purpose. Was he not, he said, especially the pastor of his priests, and how could he exhort them to risk their lives for their people, if he, their head and archbishop, feared to put himself in the same danger for them, and moreover broke his word so often pledged to them, that he would administer the last sacraments to them? The lives of all were in the hand of God, and if it should please him to call him to himself at this time, they were not to distress themselves, but have confidence in his mercy, on which alone the safety of the city depended, and he would provide them with a better pastor. As it was clear he had already counted the cost, and that his resolution was not to be shaken, they had perforce to let him go on his way without further hindrance, only testifying by their sorrow the reluctance with which they saw him prefer the duties of a simple priest to his own, so highly valued by them all. He went to the sick room, and closing the door upon himself and the plague-stricken patient, gave him Holy Communion. Then, perceiving him to be near his end, he gave him the last anointing, and disposed him for death. Thus fortified with the sacraments, the blessing of his archbishop, and the plenary indulgence for the hour of death, the sick man passed to his rest. Here we must mention a memorable example of fraternal charity in a priest who is still living, Aloysius Cignolo, of the Church of St. Paul at the Meeting of the Ways, who carried his devotion to the sick so far that he not only, like the cardinal, attended upon them in their last moments, but washed and prepared their bodies for burial after death. Shortly after this event we have narrated, the saint was informed that the parish priest of St. Peter in Caminadella had been seized by the malady and was in a precarious state. He at once set out to visit him, but the sick man, hearing of his intention and unwilling that his pastor's life should be endangered, went down into the church just at the moment of the cardinal's arrival, who was much surprised, knowing him to be in a dying state. He gave him Holy Communion, and then made him return to his bed, and would have anointed him there, but the priest, rather than let him stay longer in such a place, assured him that it was not yet time. The saint persevered, however, and returning the next morning to give him extreme unction, found that he had prevailed upon some pious persons in attendance to bring him down again into the church. But St. Charles, knowing him to be at the point of death, had him carried up again to his bed, while he followed in his pontificals, and regardless of the fetid atmosphere, gave him extreme unction, staying with him through his agony, and recommending his soul to God, till he breathed his last. The saint, after this, discharged the same offices for the parish priests of St. Victor near the theatre, and of St. Babylas, and indeed, in every case that occurred, his example encouraging all to look to the safety of their brethren rather than their own. Yet he invariably adopted every precaution of prudence, and never ran any risk where there was no need. Still more cautious was he where others were concerned, and when he had been engaged where there was danger of giving infection to others, he would isolate himself for several days, doing everything for himself during that time, and he required all priests who attended the sick to observe the same rule.